The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So Shaun, did you want to bring your slides up on the screen?
There we go.
Fantastic. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Madeline Enright and I'm a Project Officer at ACTA, the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance. The topic of our webinar today is studies within a trial, and I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Shaun Treweek, who has kindly joined us from the UK to give this presentation. And just before we get to the main presentation today, I've got a couple of acknowledgements and housekeeping items. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the operational funding ACTA received from the Australian Government's Medical Research Future Fund. And just a reminder to everybody online that these webinars are being recorded and will be available on our website shortly. So if you want to review anything we covered today, or if you'd like to watch any of the other webinars we've been presenting, please head over to clinicaltrialsalliance.org.au, where you'll find the relevant links in our latest news section. If you've got any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll be on hand to address any technical questions during the presentation, and I'll read out any of the content-related questions at the end of the webinar for Shaun to address. So now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for the day, Professor Shaun Treweek from the Health Services Research Unit at the University of Aberdeen. Shaun is a health services researcher interested in efficient trial design, particularly around recruitment and retention, and the effective presentation of research evidence. He also helped to develop PRECIS2, a tool to match trial design decisions to the information needs of those intended to use the results. He leads an initiative called Trial Forge that aims to be more systematic about how we identify, generate, and use research evidence in making trial design, conduct, analysis, and reporting decisions. Finally, Shaun is an editor-in-chief of the journal Trials. Welcome, Shaun, and thanks again for getting up bright and early to give this presentation today.
Thank you. So hopefully you can hear me, Madeline, all well?
Yes, that's fine.
Excellent. Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for asking me to give this talk. So what I want to talk about today is something called a study within a trial, which is a way of increasing the evidence base that we have to support our own trial process decisions, things like how we should put together a good recruitment strategy, or how we put together a good trial retention strategy, or how would we select the sites for a multi-center trial, or our data collection system, or how to disseminate the results. Those sorts of decisions are things we make all the time. And what I'm going to show you is that actually we don't have the evidence for those sorts of decisions that really we perhaps should. And I want to talk about how we might improve that situation. Okay, first problem is I'm not moving forwards. Oh, excellent. Let's hope that stays fine. So trials are very important. We all know that. That's why we do those trials. So a few years ago, an Irish methodology research network decided that it would be great to run a campaign on Twitter with a few quotes from people working within the field, mainly in the UK, but not all, just saying something about why they think trials are important. And this one is from Professor Howell Williams, who's the director of what is probably the UK's largest public funder of randomized trials. And what he said was, look, trials are the backbone of primary research that we use here in the National Health Service. They really do change lives. They really do affect the care day to day that patients and health professionals are together providing here in the UK, and of course, well beyond it. So the work we do influences the clinical care received by millions of people. And that's exactly as it should be. That gives us purpose with what we're doing. Those trials are very important. That then makes it odd that while we are doing something, a randomized trial that is as important as that, it will affect lives, that the evidence that we have to support our own decisions, such as those I was mentioning earlier, how we recruit people, how we retain people, how we select sites, etc. The evidence available to us is very thin indeed. This is a great quote from Monica Shah, a US-based researcher, and they were thinking about site selection in cardiovascular trials. And she made this observation, it's weird really, that this thing that is very important, the randomized trial, when we come to make our own decisions, we rely on experience and judgment, what we did last time, because actually we don't have an alternative. There is no substantial evidence base to support our decision making. And remember, just to keep drawing us back to why we are doing trials, the evidence that our randomized clinical trials provide, we believe, will improve the clinical decisions of patients and healthcare professionals and the policy decisions of policymakers. We think that by providing evidence, it improves those decisions. And yet for our own decisions, that isn't currently part of our thinking. We don't have that evidence. So if it works for clinical professionals, it's quite reasonable, I think, to believe that if we had more evidence to support our own decisions, that might improve the efficiency of our trial process decision making, makes it more effective. There'll be less research waste, which was the starting point for much of the work I'm talking about today in this project, which is called Trial Forge. The idea here with this initiative is, well, okay, let's see if we can start to address some of these evidence gaps that we have in our ability to do evidence-informed trial process decision making. And the block of squares on the right and that wheel, the idea there is to represent the pathway from a research question through to disseminating the trial results. So lots of decisions we have to make, and we have little or no evidence for very, very many of them. There are lots of decisions we have to make in the lifetime of a trial. I'm going to talk about two trial processes. I'm going to talk about recruitment, and I'm going to talk about retention. Now, there's some good reasons why I'm talking about these two. Here in the UK, a few years ago, there was a survey done of the directors of clinical trials units. So these units, of which we have about 50 in the UK, their directors who lead groups of people with expertise in running trials, those directors were asked, what are the things that keep you awake at night? What are the things about trials that you really do believe we ought to be doing more methodological research to try and improve the process evidence that we have? And what came top of that list was, please do something about recruitment. And joint second, together with outcome selection, was retention. So here in the UK, these are right at the top of the list of worries that UK clinical trials unit directors, and indeed others, funders, worry about this as well. Sponsors worry about this. These things are of great concern here in the UK. So the reason in Aberdeen, where I work, we focus on recruitment, retention, and outcome selection is because these are the UK top priorities for methodological work within trials. So a few facts and figures about recruitment and retention. So somebody a few years ago called Hilda Bastian, who actually is Australian, if I remember correctly, did some work with colleagues trying to figure out how many trial reports and indeed systematic reviews are published every year, new ones. And at that time, for trial reports, it looked like around about 25,000 a year, plus or minus. And that's almost certainly an underestimate because it's almost certainly just the academic ones, or largely academic-led trials. But let's say 25,000 trials a year published. That's a lot of trials. That means that right now there are thousands and thousands of trials going on, and you'd anticipate that we'd be good at recruitment given the number of trials that we do. But where people look at cohorts of trials to find out how many were successful is generally around about 50%. And to be honest, that's almost certainly too kind because of the way those cohorts are selected. They tend to use, in fact, actually, they're very often UK cohorts of trials, but from these big public funders. And those streams are very competitive, so the trial teams are generally very good. So I'd anticipate that if you move away from these big, well-funded trials with really good teams, that success rate will fall away from 50% quite quickly. And other studies have found that you might have a quarter of all trials are not only unsuccessful, but are abandoned completely because of recruitment. So recruitment is a problem. And of course, if you don't have any participants, your trial is dead. Doesn't matter what else you do. So recruitment, that's why we worry about it. And probably at best, about half of trials hit their targets on time. Retention was something of a Cinderella compared to recruitment for some time. People worried about recruitment, much less so about retention. That's changing in the UK. So we are now getting equally concerned about retention. Clearly, a person who has joined a trial, that's the recruitment, that's great. But in terms of your data, you need that individual to stay with the trial until your data collection point. So if they drop out, you might as well have not recruited them. So retention is also now attracting attention. And again, where people look, about half of all trials lose 10% or more, and some lose a lot more of their participants than 10%. So that, again, same cohorts, probably as good as it gets. If you move away from that, it probably gets a little bit worse. Both of these big problems, and by no means solved, in the sense that despite us doing thousands and thousands of trials right now around the world, these two absolutely key processes are not fixed. We lose about 10% of participants at least in half of our trials, and probably about half of those trials will have recruitment problems. So that's why these are worth focusing on, and it's not as though we've got the problem fixed. There is a problem to be addressed. Thinking about the recruitment one, you would think, given those trials and the fact that recruitment essentially is something needed for all trials, that we'd have a lot of evidence to support our decisions. And for now over 10 years, I've been looking after the Cochrane review of strategies to improve recruitment, a review of what people have tried. And in fact, if we cut to the chase, these three things are the only things in that entire global systematic review for which we can say we have high certainty evidence of benefit as far as recruitment is concerned. So one is, let's not have a blinded trial, let's have it open. The middle one is about phoning people who have not responded to a postal invitation. And then the last one is a particular way of developing the written participant information that you would provide to a person who is considering taking part. And in terms of high certainty evidence, as judged using the grade system, a very well-respected way of making judgments about how much confidence we should place in a body of evidence, these are the only three that have high. And actually the telephone reminder has a caveat. So it's not even three, really. And that's it. Absolutely central process in a trial, recruitment. And we have evidence for about 2.5 things. And that really ought to be quite shocking to us. We try lots of things, all of us in trials are doing lots of things to try and improve our recruitment. And actually, to a first approximation, whatever it is we're doing, there is no high certainty evidence that it is effective. I mean, it might be, but we just don't know. And that's the problem that this systematic review has been highlighting for 10 years. That situation that you see in front of you with three things that we have high certainty evidence for has not changed in 10 years. And if we look at a lot of the other things that have been evaluated, they're often quite poorly done. So it's a great shock, really, when you look across that for a process so important as recruitment. If we move to retention, this is a review that has until recently been led by a group outside Aberdeen, but Aberdeen has recently taken over this review. If we look to the sorts of things within it that might suggest benefit, then it boils down principally to, if you are sending out a questionnaire, well, why don't you pay people? You're more likely to get that questionnaire returned. And that essentially, again, is it within the review. These other last two bullet points come from other sorts of evidence that will go into the review. So the review's reasonably old. Reminders are likely to work. And there's a theory-based cover letter that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So again, for a process which is absolutely central to any trial, we want to keep our participants in the trial. There is remarkably little evidence available to any of us to make our trial retention strategy more evidence-based. And again, that ought to be quite a shock to us, really, because retention is not a peripheral process. It's right at the heart of all our trials. Recruitment is not a peripheral process. It is bang in the center of a successful trial. So that's all doom and gloom, but are there things that we can do that will change that situation? So is there brightness ahead? And yes is the answer. I think we are starting to make some headway. And two things that can help these are not going to solve all the problems of trial evidence, but here are two things that I think are central. Firstly, studies within a trial, SWATs. I'll talk a little bit about those. And then secondly, it's just something I'll keep mentioning, is that we really do need to start to do things much more collaboratively. So a little bunch of people beavering away in Aberdeen are not going to fix this problem. This is something that needs real international collaboration to push forward things so that we're not sitting for 10 years with an evidence base that remains unchanged. So what is a study within a trial? So the types of design that these describe, and I'll mention that in a moment, have been kicking about for a while, but the name SWAT, just having that name has really helped things. And it was Mike Clark, who's pictured here from Belfast in the UK, who coined this phrase. And his key point was, if we have an uncertainty in a clinical situation, should we use treatment A or treatment B, then what we would do is a randomized trial. That's what we do day in, day out in our jobs. His point is, if we have then an uncertainty with regard to a trial process alternatives, should we use this participant information leaflet or should we do it like this? Well, basically that's the same thing, and we should use the same method, a randomized evaluation. Studies within a trial, actually, technically speaking, don't need to be randomized, but for everything I'm going to talk about today, I'm thinking of a randomized SWAT. So what is a SWAT? It's actually conceptually really simple. All it is a study dropped into a host clinical trial. So within a real clinical trial that's addressing a real clinical question, we would drop in an evaluation of, for example, participant information leaflet 1 against participant information leaflet 2, and we would compare the 2 or 3 or 4 or however we wanted to design that SWAT. And for our purposes, who got which alternative, which participant information leaflet, would be decided at random. So it would be a randomized trial within a host randomized clinical trial. And that's all it is. You can see a reference at the bottom. So there is a short document which we've called Trial Forge Guidance 1, what is a SWAT? So that gives that definition there and a few key pointers to things that are worth thinking about. But it's nice and short, and we deliberately tried to make that document short. So that essentially is all a SWAT is. Here are some key features. As I mentioned a moment ago with Mike Clark's comment, the SWAT is aiming to resolve some important uncertainty in the same way that we do in randomized clinical trials. There is an uncertainty we have, should we do this or this? And we seek to address that uncertainty by doing a randomized evaluation. A SWAT is embedded within a host trial. There are some evaluations done in the past within hypothetical trials. And in our systematic review of recruitment strategies, they all come out badly on grade. And in the next update of that review, we are going to ditch all of them. And there are a lot of them. So probably about a third of the total evidence linked to recruitment will be ditched in that review at the next update, because essentially we have no confidence in it. So we want SWATs in real trials, and there are plenty of examples now of SWATs in real trials. There's no excuse for not putting them into a real trial. We don't want to mess up the host trial, so we don't want the SWAT to undermine the main clinical trial, clearly. So that's a given. And there are sometimes some legitimate concerns around that. So there's a discussion needed with the chief investigator and his or her colleagues regarding what impact in a negative way doing the SWAT might have on the host clinical trial. The SWAT deserves a protocol, just like the main trial, and we can do them across more than one trial, and this is where SWATs become very powerful. A single evaluation is moderately interesting, but if you do it in multiple trials, either in parallel or in series, preferably parallel, speeds things up, then that brings so much more power, and I'll give an example of that in a moment. And they can, inform decisions about the trial in which they are embedded. So I have done one myself where we were uncertain about a particular decision we were going to make within the trial itself. So in other words, we had an uncertainty, and the best way to resolve that uncertainty was to do a SWAT. We embedded random allocation. It was actually methods of inviting people to take part in the trial. And at the end of a few months, we looked at our SWAT data and then said, okay, this one is looking most promising. That's the one we'll do for the rest of the trial. So these are not always only about helping other people with their trials in the future. You can use them to improve decision making within the actual trial in which it's embedded. Right, so that's what they are, but what have SWATs ever actually done for us? Now, until relatively recently, this would be a trickier case to make because there were so few of them, but now we actually have quite a few. So I'm going to talk you through 3 examples, and just to highlight a few particular points. This is the first one. I've been talking quite a bit about, as an example, participant information leaflets, and really it's because of this one. This is what I have in my mind. So a few years ago, a project led by Peter Bauer at the University of Manchester here in the UK called MRC Start thought, why don't we evaluate a couple of trial recruitment interventions? So instead of doing dreaming up a dozen different things we could try, let's just choose a couple of things and evaluate them, and crucially evaluate them in several trials more or less in parallel, because then what we'll be able to do is collect all of the data, put it into a meta-analysis, and look at the overall effect in different trials. So when that participant information leaflet has been evaluated in multiple trials. And remember, when I start talking about this in a moment, that in that systematic review that I mentioned for recruitment, there are things in there that have not changed within a 10-year period. So 10 years ago, we weren't really sure whether they worked. 10 years later, we're still not sure whether they worked. The great advantage here, the innovation really here, was let's do it collaboratively and coordinate evaluation of a particular SWAT intervention. So in 2015, they put this participant information leaflet into a trial. The key thing about the participant information leaflet is it had a lot of user testing. So it was developed together with people like those who the trial team wanted to recruit. There's a graphic designer involved, so the presentation was done together with a designer and people like those they were aiming to recruit. But the content was, broadly speaking, exactly as an ethics committee, these are all UK trials, but as a UK ethics committee would want it to be. So we're not dropping things that an ethics committee might otherwise want to see in that participant information. It was really about navigation of the information, presentation, and tools to make it easier to understand, like a contents list, that sort of thing. So the first evaluation was done in 2015, and this picture here shows you, okay, we've got a little square there which shows our effect estimate from that single trial. It's about 2% or so. So that's saying a 2% absolute improvement in recruitment in that trial amongst those participants who got this type of participant information leaflet called a START pill. But as I mentioned a moment ago, one evaluation is interesting, but no more than that. It's a single trial. What is more interesting is, well, how does it perform if you put it into many trials? So START, MRC Start, have published now 4 evaluations of exactly the same SWAT intervention. And what this is on screen right now is a cumulative meta-analysis. So each, as you move down, each effect estimate includes all of the data above. So you can see on here from 2015, there were a couple of studies where it did quite well, and then a couple of others where the effect was less good. So cumulatively, what we're looking at right now is our best estimate is that using this particular way of showing the participant information leads to a 1% improvement, plus or minus, in recruitment. And you can see the confidence interval, that's that blue thing at the bottom, stretches a little bit into, well, actually, maybe it's not helping, or a little bit higher towards 2%. But we know that we can be pretty confident in that. So if you look at the grade rating at the bottom. All of these studies were very well done. So this body of evidence is high certainty evidence. That effect estimate is beginning to settle. It's not all over the place. As we add more studies, it's starting to settle. And that information, I think, not only can we have confidence in it, but we can also start to think, well, actually, we can make decisions, an evidence-informed decision by looking at that. If in the UK, I think if you were to use this way of developing the participant information leaflet, it is likely to lead to a 1% or thereabouts improvement in recruitment compared to the leaflets that you might otherwise have done. So the idea here is that we now have much more certainty about whether this intervention is worth doing or not. We make the judgment as to whether it's worth it, but we have evidence that can inform that judgment. If I go into another example, this is probably familiar to yourselves in Australia too, is financial incentives. So we may say, happens quite a lot in the UK, we would say as a thanks, token of our appreciation, if you decide to be recruited, we will give you a shopping voucher for £10 or £20, something like that. Pretty common here in the UK as a recruitment intervention, and indeed as a retention intervention. This is recruitment, and this is the body of evidence. It's much messier than the one we saw just a moment ago for that participant information leaflet. It's also a cumulative meta-analysis, so each dot as you move down includes everything that's above it, and it is waving. So it's sort of more slinky like a snake. So you'll notice from the grade evidence at the bottom, this is moderate, and it's because of that movement, that inconsistency. The actual studies themselves were well done, but the results they are presenting to us are somewhat inconsistent, and that has pulled it down. But if you are thinking right now for your trial, okay, should financial incentives be part of an evidence-informed trial recruitment strategy? If you look to where the bulk of all those effect estimates and confidence intervals are for financial incentives as a recruitment intervention, then you'd look at that and say, well, actually, most of it, almost all of it, is suggesting that if I was to use a small financial incentive, it is odds on that that is going to improve my recruitment. It's not going to transform my recruitment. We're looking at single figures, 4%, say, something like that. But it's likely to improve your recruitment. And I think you can look at that and make right now a judgment based on evidence in a way that you would not for many, many other types of intervention that we may use routinely within trials to help recruitment. So again, what this sort of evaluation provides us with is some evidence which we can build into the judgments we make as to whether one or other intervention can be used. And these all come from SWATs. And particularly importantly here is that they've all evaluated the same intervention, so we can sensibly combine them like this. There are some caveats, and we might come on to that perhaps in questions later on. All of this I'm showing you now is UK. It would be fabulous to have Australian evaluations, because that would really improve our contextual information, different contexts evaluating some of these interventions. This is the last one I'm going to show you. This is a retention intervention. And this is, you probably remember from when I mentioned the retention systematic review, that within the review itself, the evidence that it presents boils down to how to improve response rates to questionnaires that are sent out to collect trial data. The innovation here, which came from colleagues at the University of Dundee in Scotland, was if we send out a questionnaire to a participant to try and collect some data, what we are also going to include with that questionnaire is a cover letter. Dear Shaun, thank you for taking part in our trial. Could you please complete this questionnaire? There will be a cover letter. The innovation from Dundee colleagues was, why don't we think of that letter as a behavioral change intervention? So the way the letter was written using psychological theory to try and improve the chances that it influences the behavior of returning that questionnaire. The actual letter itself doesn't get much longer. It's slightly longer, but it's still a page or thereabouts. And I'm not a psychologist, but there is a template. And I think you could produce the theory-based cover letter easily in an afternoon, less than an hour, I'd say, using that template and knowledge of your own trial. So this is what I would say is the cheapest chips intervention that you're going to have to send out a cover letter anyway. You're not going to just send the questionnaire. Do it like this. What's the benefit to retention? So this again has been evaluated in multiple trials. So we've got 4 evaluations here, and again a bit messy. That's why the grade assessment is moderate, not high. The evaluations themselves are good, but it's the inconsistency and effect estimate. But again, look at where the bulk of that evidence is sitting. The bulk of it is sitting on the side of, we think this is likely to improve retention. It's more likely to improve it than to do harm. And this is a really cheap, easy intervention to generate. It involves very little additional work. You're going to have to do some work, but you'd have to do it anyway. And again, you could start to build that into your evidence-informed retention strategy. If we're sending out questionnaires, is this an intervention that we should use? And the evidence that would feed into that decision is, in my opinion, definitely supporting the use of this intervention. It's not perfect because it's not high certainty evidence. It's all UK evidence. So it's not that more evaluations are unnecessary. I think they are, but it would be great to have more evaluations outside the UK, for example, would be very important, but that would give us more confidence that there was a real effect here. But for a UK-based trial, looking at that body of evidence, if I was making a decision, I would say we should just do this. If we're sending out questionnaires, we should send out theory-based cover letters, because it will improve our response rates, our retention, by a few percent for little or no additional work. So that's the sort of evidence that we're trying to build with SWATs. Each trial team will make judgments itself about whether each individual intervention is something for it. But the idea is that you have much more confidence when selecting interventions that might support recruitment, retention, etc. if you know something about the effect that they have had in a body, not a single, but a body of trials. So I am pretty confident in a UK context about that theory-based cover letter. Similarly with financial incentives. If I was moving to an Australian context, I would have much less idea, because none of those evaluations have been done in Australia. It would be interesting to see some international ones. We might, nobody wants to suggest that we have to do an evaluation in every single country of the world for this to work, but certainly more than the UK. It would be nice to expand the context. So I talked about guidance. So we have that short document that I've already mentioned. This is published in Trials. There's a reference there. It's easy to find. I think you'll probably get the slides too. We also have another guidance document which is working through the peer review process. It's available as preprint currently. And essentially what this is asking is, if we have a body of evidence about a particular SWAT intervention, do we need to do another evaluation? So what we're trying to do here is stop doing evaluations of SWAT interventions as soon as we can, so that we can focus our attentions on other things. So you could imagine the financial incentives and say, do we need to do more evaluations? And because I have actually done the judgment process for that, the answer is yes. But what we really like is more evaluations of financial incentives, for example, outside the UK. And that's to do with context. So if you were to look at that paper that's in front of you right now, Trial Forward Guidance 2, a lot of it is about context. There's also stuff about the grade, the certainty of evidence. But we're trying to get we have got a bunch of people who have come together to say, these are the criteria we should use in making a judgment. Do we need more evaluations, or do we think we have enough information for decision making? We don't want to go on ad infinitum. So if you have a chance and you're interested, have a look at both of those guidance documents. I've spoken to a lot of people about SWATs, and one of the questions I've been asking recently is what would make doing them easier. So in your context, whatever that context happens to be, what would make doing them easier? Top of the list is a list of the most important SWATs. So you can get people who are interested in the idea but would like some sort of steer towards SWATs that they can be assured are important and therefore worth doing. And there are two processes I've highlighted here, those two logos with priority written in them. The first one on the left, the priority with the prioritizing recruitment one. So that's drawn up a list of the top 10 unanswered questions in trial recruitment. So that's a very formal process that's involved lots of people, including patients and health professionals and ethics people and funders people and researchers. And the one next to it, priority 2, is predictably the same process, but now for retention. So we have two lists of the top 10 unanswered research questions. They tend to be quite broad, but if we look at those lists and link them to the systematic reviews, looking for areas of uncertainty, then we can map across the two priority processes and the systematic reviews. And we also have another systematic review where we collaborate with some Irish colleagues, where we're looking at the factors that influence recruitment, and we'll do the same for retention. So we would map across all of those reviews and prioritization processes, and we will come up with a list of priority SWATs. And just to give you a spoiler, financial incentives will be one of them. There's a great uncertainty. They're very frequently used, and they are in the priority top 20, actually, not top 10, but top 20. So it would be that sort of thing. If you're interested in doing a SWAT, why don't you look at financial incentives, for example? That would be one of the important ones. People have also said there are some infrastructure changes that are sometimes required for SWATs, and one that comes up here in the UK, what would they mean by infrastructure really is approvals. The approvals process for SWATs can either be remarkably smooth or troublingly difficult. And it depends often not on the actual approvals rules, if you like, the regulations, but the interpretation of those rules by local institutions. So sometimes you hit a wall and sometimes it's absolutely fine. And it's often not the rules themselves, it's the interpretation of those rules, because SWATs are a bit weird and new, and people are a bit unfamiliar with them. So in the UK, we are trying to make some changes to the approvals process, and it's actually less about introducing new rules, because we're not suggesting that, but about clarifying how SWATs are handled within the existing system, because that will make doing them easier. And I suspect there are things that parallel that in other jurisdictions too. And the final one is collaboration. So that MRC Start project generated evidence which is high certainty evidence. There were very good evaluations, and it did it in 3 years for one intervention. So if you are building that, an assessment of that intervention, that particular participant information leaflet, into your decision, should we use it or should we not, you could have great certainty in that information if you were based in the UK, because they're all UK evaluations. But it was done in 3 years. There are things that have been in the Cochrane Systematic Review of Recruitment Strategy, the thing I've looked after, that have been in there for 10 years, and we have no more idea now whether they are worth doing than we had 10 years ago. And that's because there's no collaboration and there's no coordination. Somebody has a bright idea, does an evaluation, and nobody else ever does a replication of that evaluation. And sometimes the original evaluation was rubbish. So what we want to move away from is a sort of scattergun approach. Let's focus around doing evaluations of important SWATs, and we'll do them well, and we'll do them together, so that in a relatively short period of time, we bottom out a question. Okay, yes, we have high certainty evidence that this is likely to lead to an improvement of the order of 1 or 2%. We know definitely that that information leaflet is not going to improve your recruitment by 40%. No way. We are pretty certain it's going to be 1% or thereabouts. And that's useful information. You can build it into a strategy or make a decision it's not worth it for you. That's what we're trying to get to. The prioritization list that I mentioned, we're being supported in that by a new initiative within TrialForge, which is the idea of having TrialForge centers. So as I mentioned right at the start, this problem is not going to be solved by a bunch of us in Aberdeen beavering away. So we have a bunch of us in Aberdeen beavering away, but we also have colleagues dotted around, and we have a new Trial Forge Centre in York, so a Northern English city, and they are focusing on SWATs. So in Trial Forge more generally, we do some other stuff. What they're really focused on in York are SWATs. So we have another centre in Bristol, which is another city in England, a bit further south. They are also interested in recruitment, but less on these sorts of SWATs that we've been talking about today, and more on a whole approach to how you do the recruitment process. And we have another centre actually in Basel in Switzerland, and they're looking at resource use and can we improve our judgments about how much resource is required when planning trials. So the idea is that we would spread out activity, and again, it would be an absolute delight if there was some interest within Australia in this sort of idea, sort of bringing together people in a particular area, perhaps to focus on one thing in particular, but under the umbrella of the Trial Forge idea of trying to improve the efficiency of trials by generating evidence. Okay, so I'm going to summarize now. So we need, I think, evidence to support our trial process decisions, and it is quite remarkable when we sit back and reflect as to how little evidence we are able to bring to the table when making decisions about how do we recruit, how do we retain, how do we select sites, how do we do the data collection, how do we do dissemination, etc. How do we provide information to participants? There is remarkably little evidence to support any of those decisions. And yet, if we look at the processes themselves, particularly recruitment and retention, because that's what I know best, we know that there are problems. It's not as though we have fixed them, because we haven't. So we do need to bring something additional to the table, and I think that's some evidence. SWATs are one way of doing it. They are not the only way. There are some questions that they are perfect for, other things where a SWAT might be less than optimal, but I think they have an important role, and they are conceptually quite simple. Focus is important. The sort of scattergun approach spreads what resources we have very thin and can lead to not being able to answer any question with any degree of certainty for a long period of time. So if we focus in a coordinated way on a bunch of SWATs and really try and do those in multiple trials, so we do replication studies, we are much more likely to come to a conclusion that is useful for decision making, in the same way that Pete Bauer did with the MRC Start project. And just to end, coordination, collaboration. In other words, working together. So we're very, very keen on collaboration, because it's the only way to move from stuff that hangs around with great uncertainty for a decade through to having uncertainty reduced to an acceptable level within a very short period of time. And by acceptable, what I mean is, okay, there is some uncertainty, but as far as our decisions are concerned, we are still confident now that this will improve or not improve whatever process we're looking at. We don't need perfection, we just need good enough to support a sensible decision. This is a plug, and then I'm finished. So if any of you are thinking of coming over to the UK in October for the International Clinical Trials Methodology Conference, which is going to be held in Brighton, then if you are coming over, thank you very much, because I know it's a long trek, having done it in the opposite direction before. So thank you. If you're interested in coming to an open Trial Forge meeting, then we're having a meeting on the very first day where the conference itself starts to do things, which is Sunday the 6th. So this meeting, the Trial Forge one, is completely free. Actually, don't even have to be going to do the conference. So it's completely free, and we would like to talk about these sorts of things, so not only SWATs, but this general idea of how we can improve the efficiency of trials in a collaborative way. And that was it. That's where I'd like to end. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been great to be invited to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Shaun. That was really great. And glad to see that you've put your little plug in for your working meeting there. Your meeting seems to tack on to the end of the ACTA international meeting that we have, which finishes up on the 5th of October. So if anyone's particularly keen from Sydney over to the UK, I think you'd just be able to make it in time.
Yes. indeed.
Now, we do have a few questions coming through about the type of studies that you've looked at in your reviews. Have they been mainly publicly funded, public good, investigator-initiated kind of trials? And is there any evidence of them being done in commercial or industry trials?
That's actually it's a very good question and easy to answer. So the answer is all of those evaluations are in academically led trials. So we right now have no knowledge of a SWAT or something like a SWAT being done in industry. They may be being done, but there's no, we're not aware of it. We're not seeing them in the reviews. That guidance documents, the two of them that I mentioned, we do have some industry involvement in those. So GSK have had involvement in both guidance 1 and guidance 2, and some CROs as well are interested, but as yet we have struggled a bit to get industry involved, but they're definitely on our list of people we'd like to work with and indeed are working with, but we haven't yet managed to bring industry into one of these collaborative SWOT evaluations.
Okay, thank you. We've had another question in here. In regards to your Cochrane review, you mentioned 3 main types of strategies that you can use: having an open label trial, telephone follow-up, clearer participant information forms, and the increase in retention or recruitment that you would get from those. Is there any evidence that these would be cumulative? So if we were to utilise all 3 strategies at once, are we going to suddenly see 17% increased retention?
No. So there's no as the honest answer. So I get asked that quite a lot. So the way we're setting things up right now with these is they're individual evaluations. So you can imagine the way things are going right now, that you would look at let's say it's a website, and you'd have a bunch of individual interventions from which you pick. And then the obvious question is, well, do I get more or less by combining these than I would get if I combine those instead? Don't know. So I think right now what we're planning to do is just to get individual interventions. I've just started thinking about bundles. What would happen if we packaged some of these interventions together, and how we might, well, either how we might evaluate it, or indeed whether we worry about that at all, or whether we think, okay, there's good evidence that these interventions are likely to be effective to this sort of effect size, and we'll just combine them, perhaps because they logistically go well together, and we at this stage have no reason to believe that they will work against each other. But to directly answer the questioner's question, it's a good question to ask: is it cumulative? And the answer is right now we do not know. We could evaluate them, and that might be something that all of us would get interested in once we start to get to the position where we have a reasonable number of these, where we have a high certainty evidence, and we start to get more concerned about what's the effect of the combination as opposed to what's the effect of each individual intervention.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So it sounds like a project for the future, but not the immediate future.
Yeah.
We've also had quite a few questions coming in about financial incentives, and how do you juggle financial incentives with ethics and potential selection bias?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That body of evidence that we have right now, there are 6 studies in there, and actually 5 of them were done by the same group in Dundee. And when they put their proposal to the ethics committee to evaluate their financial incentives, they had to work with the ethics committee to find a way of doing it that satisfied the committee. That group in all 5 of those trials was giving £100, which is much bigger than we would normally attempt to do here in the UK, because we would worry about what the view of the ethics committee would be. But the way they actually did it in those 5 studies, which I thought was quite clever, the solution they came up with was that everybody got £100, but only half of them were told they would get £100. So what happened was that half of them were told, we'll offer £100 if you sign up. The other half were not told that they would get £100. If they did nevertheless sign up, they got £100, which was a big surprise. But so everybody had the same offer. The question, of course, is do we, by offering £100, or indeed even 10 or 20, persuade people who actually would otherwise not join the trial to join the trial? So they join simply for the incentive. And with larger financial incentives, I think that is a good question to ask. And £100 in the UK, you would generally struggle, I think, to get that approved, because it would worry people a bit too much. Generally, what we're offering is something like 10 or 20 pounds. So it's a judgment. It's a common question that comes up at ethics here in the UK. But more and more, if it's in the order of about £10, it's not considered to be coercive. It's more a token of appreciation than something that's going to be crucial in driving a decision. That's how I think quite reasonably they're interpreted. And I guess as time goes on, what we could start to say is, we have a body of evidence that suggests they are effective, then it might also add something to that balance. If there's no obvious evidence right now that offering £10 would be coercive in the sense that it brings people to the trial who would otherwise not join. They get their money and then they drop out. So we could look at retention. So a sensible thing to do perhaps would be, if we wanted to evaluate this, would be, let's look at recruitment, financial incentives as a recruitment intervention, but then also look at retention, because what you might expect is that people join and then drop out because they're not actually interested in the trial. They just wanted the money. It has driven their decision. And right now, we don't have good evidence to suggest that there is that problem for incentives that are widely used in the UK, which are in the order of about £10. The £100 one, bit more difficult, I think, to be quite so confident about that. But in that particular example, everybody got the £100. So at least in that sense, it was fair.
Great, thank you. Now we have another question. Earlier on, you mentioned that SWATs do not have to be randomised. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more and how you would assess those? Yeah,
sure. So I think for everything I've been talking about, what we're trying to evaluate is alternative 1 more effective than alternative 2? And I think in that situation, they have to be randomized. If we're going to do them, we should do them in a randomized way. If we have any chance at all, we should do it randomized, as we would for a clinical trial. Alternative A versus alternative B, we would want to randomize it. But within the SWAT definition, the way that they were set up is that, well, sometimes it's not possible, and you might have you can take the view, which I don't disagree with, which is that some evidence is better than no evidence, as long as that evidence is interpreted appropriately. So the very first SWAT that was done and published is actually a before-after study of a recruitment intervention, and it was a rescue intervention. So the trial was recruiting badly, and the trial team thought, well, okay, should we send the chief investigator or one of the senior team out to the sites that are not recruiting well to do a sort of pep talk, encourage them, motivate them a bit about the trial? Will that improve recruitment? And that was simply a before-after, because they wanted to do it really quickly, and they only had a few sites, so they thought, no, we just need to do it now. So they did it as a before-after, and they looked at the recruitment in those sites prior to the senior person going to visit, and then they looked at the recruitment after, and actually they found a small increase. So it looked promising, but then they put lots of caveats around the interpretation of their results, because it was a before-after. So it suggests that might be worth doing in a randomized way. So if they did it while the trial was running, they could potentially now say, oh, it would be worth evaluating in a randomized way, which is what they said. And just one more example is that some studies within a trial are actually qualitative. So some people have taken that S, the study, very broadly, which it is, and you could think, okay, what we're going to do, our study that's going to be embedded is we're going to look at a particular problem within the trial in a qualitative way to try and tease out some of the reasons for that problem being what it is, so that we can then say to the world, or indeed ourselves, okay, this is the problem, these are the potential solutions, and then try and implement them. So study within a trial can also mean qualitative work, which clearly wouldn't be randomized.
All right, thank you. Now, I think we've got time for just a couple more questions, so if anybody has any more, please type them in now. One here about, given that every trial is likely to be different, would you be better off doing a feasibility study or a pilot study to evaluate the recruitment and evaluation process for your particular cohort that you're trying to recruit?
Yes, so we're not suggesting that you don't do feasibility studies for that reason. So all trials are likely to have their own issues. So again, here in the UK, feasibility studies, we always do them. But I guess what we might want to move towards is that if we had more interventions to support, for example, recruitment, for which we had evidence of benefit from many different types of study. So if we take the theory-based cover letter, for example, the evidence base that we have right now is from dental, multiple sclerosis, and it's an eye trial, or eye condition. So 3 different types of trial, all UK though, so the context is a bit limited. But if we had a body of evidence that was not 3 different conditions or 3 areas, but 10, say, then what we might find is that if it worked across that body of evidence, that it's reasonable to build it into our recruitment strategy, even though we know the trials are, each one has its own concerns and issues. And we find that within the feasibility work that we might do, that over time, we start to pick up fewer problems with recruitment because we have a larger evidence base to inform our initial recruitment, our initial proposed recruitment strategy. So I don't think it will remove the need for feasibility studies, but I'm hoping that over time it might reduce the number of problems we have to try and fix in the feasibility study. So we're starting to be really fine-tuning rather than hitting substantial problems within feasibility. And the one last thing on the feasibility is my own experience of doing feasibilities, and we have done quite a lot, is that we can fix some problems, but generally because we are involving a small number of centres in what might then be a much larger multi-centre study, we find that the problems are often, they boil down to individual people sometimes particular person's views or the resources available in a particular site. And even if we do the feasibility study, those sorts of things don't get picked up on it because there's something peculiar about some of the sites compared to the others. So I think there's going to be always a multi-pronged approach to trying to identify potential problems and avoid them where we can. And SWATs have a role, but are no means the entire solution.
Okay, well, Shaun, I think we're just about out of time, and it looks like we've covered most of our questions off there. So thank you again for joining us today, and thank you everyone for your participation. Hopefully we'll start to see more SWATs popping up in the Australian context quite soon, and perhaps some people ducking off from the ACTA International Conference to come and visit the UK. So
well, that would be fabulous on both there.
Yes. So to the audience, hopefully we'll see you back in the coming weeks. We've got a few more webinars coming up. Keep an eye on our newsletter for more details on that. And if you haven't already, please sign up to the ACTA mailing list in the pop-up webinar survey that will be hitting your inboxes in the next few minutes, just to keep informed of future events that are coming up. All right. Thanks again, Shaun, and see you later.
That was great. My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.